Paul Dano's serious spin on his live-action Riddler tries to elevate his Zodiac-inspired rogue to his rightful place as one of Batman's most challenging foes. But today, we're going to take a look back at the last time the Riddler graced the silver screen. If you're a 90s kid like me, then I'm sure you have a soft spot for Jim Carrey's Riddler, even if adult you doesn't have the most dignified opinion of Batman Forever. On its way to bringing in over $184 million in the US and becoming the #1 movie of 1995, the production of Batman Forever is a fascinating story that starts with a Happy Meal fiasco, which forced Warner Brothers to change the tone of the entire franchise, and ends with Jim Carrey at the peak of his powers, reviving a C-level comic villain to steal the show.
Go ahead. You can say it. You're a genius.
So, dust off your old Nigmatech box, because we're going to take a deep dive into the truly strange history of how Jim Carrey's unsanctioned buffoonery saved Batman Forever.
That's what Tommy Lee Jones said to me too. He said he couldn't sanction my buffoonery.
We're going to get to that titular feud in a bit, but before we do, we need to talk about how Jim Carrey went from an underground star on a soon-to-be canceled sketch comedy show to a household name.
Somebody stop me!
There's no real secret to how he did it. He just dropped 3 absolute 90s comedy classics with a metric ton of quotable catchphrases.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Alrighty then. P-A-R-T. Why? Because I gotta!
And he did it all in 1 year, which is some truly GOAT-level shit for Jim Carrey. But it was his turn as the Mask that really got the attention of Warner Brothers.
You were good, kid. Real good.
While Batman Returns is undoubtedly one of the best Batman movies ever and was 1992's #1 movie, the suits at Warner Brothers weren't happy with it and wanted the franchise to go in a different direction.
That's not growth. That's a mild swelling.
Why? Because in the simpler time that was 1992, the film's darker and more adult tone caused quite the moral panic.
By now, you pretty much have had to have heard that the summer's big movie is Batman Returns, and it is already creating controversy. Some parents contend that Batman Returns, which is rated PG-13, is actually being marketed for younger children, and the movie is just too violent. Let's get an expert opinion on that from USA Today's junior movie critic, 10-year-old Danny Slasky.
It was very violent. It was a total attack against kids, the whole movie. It's just not for younger kids. Penguin always had goop coming out of his mouth.
For some reason, people got really freaked out by the black bile coming out of Penguin's mouth, and USA Today's summer junior movie critic Danny Slasky wasn't the only one who thought that.
We have a classic illustration here of kind of the Hollywood and the corporate community being out of touch with the family and out of touch with kids. I mean, McDonald's has apologized to us. They're embarrassed really now that they've thought it through.
Yeah, there was a whole to-do around the McDonald's Happy Meal tie-in with Batman Returns. Seriously, you should Google it later. It's wild. The point is, the disdain from the Danny Slaskys of the world clearly had an effect on the film's merchandising. And if yogurt has taught us anything,
merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made.
It was clear that something needed to change for Batman 3.
I remember toying with the idea of doing another one, and I remember going into Warner Brothers and having a meeting. About half hour into the meeting, I go, "You don't want me to make another one, do you?" So we just stopped it right there.
While parents were upset with Tim Burton because his Batman movie was too violent, America was falling in love with the hero of another comic book movie, The Mask.
Smokehead!
Jim Carrey's depiction of Stanley Ipkiss in The Mask really set the stage for his soon-to-be Riddler performance. Carrey's turn as the Tex Avery-inspired zoot suit-wearing vigilante who engages in multiple comically violent rampages to take down the Edge City Kingpin was a tour de force of Carrey's on-screen charisma.
You love me. You really love me.
And it was also horribly violent, but in the parentally accepted way Looney Tunes are. And as it turns out, that was the exact tone the Batman Forever producers were looking for. Now, they just needed to flesh out the cast. With Tim Burton out, the producers went with director Joel Schumacher, who is tasked with injecting a bit of that Bill Finger-inspired camp into the 90s Gotham City Burton created. Michael Keaton was originally supposed to reprise his role, but disagreements about the film's new direction and stalled out salary negotiations caused him to drop out. Early on, it was looking like Robin Williams was going to play the Riddler, but his alleged salary demands didn't pan out either. Truth is, Warner's knew they were taking a bit of a gamble with the 90s camp direction and chose to invest mostly in up-and-comers like Val Kilmer, Nicole Kidman, and Chris O'Donnell. But when it came to Two-Face, one of the film's producers, Peter McGregor Scott, had a specific actor in mind: Tommy Lee Jones.
However, you pose a most interesting proposition. Therefore, heads, we accept, and tails, we blow your damn head off.
Initially, Jones wasn't impressed, but he was ultimately won over by one of the most compelling motivations for taking a comic book role: wanting to be a cool dad.
I'd never heard of Harvey Two-Face, even though I'd read the comic books when I was a child. But my son knew who he was immediately and was very enthusiastic about the movie. And it was his enthusiasm that was decisive for me, really. Ordinarily, I look for certain subtleties. The comic book doesn't concern itself.
And if you're sitting there, like me, thinking that Jones's Two-Face was definitely not the performance Harvey Dent deserved, I completely agree. And I believe his underwhelming performance could be traced back to a few words in that last clip.
Ordinarily, I look for certain subtleties. The comic book doesn't concern itself.
Yeah, the whole comic book villains don't concern themselves with subtleties thing completely misses what I believe makes a good villain performance. Sure, villains do overtly evil. That's what they do. But it's the subtleties an actor infuses into their actions, like the Joker licking his scars or Defoe transforming into the Green Goblin, that makes their performances so memorable. And if there was one person in the early 90s who was the absolute king of infusing subtleties into outrageous performances, it was Jim Carrey.
Smoke a lot of dope, do you, son?
If you still weren't convinced Carrey could be the over-the-top Nigma Schumacher wanted, his mask role of Stanley Ipkiss and Edward Nigma aren't dissimilar. They're both comic book characters, and they're both timid betas craving attention and spotlight.
Let's rock this joint!
But where one is a do-gooder obsessed with animated cartoon violence, the other was a villain obsessed with puzzles and outsmarting Batman. And by the late 80s, at least to Batman comic writers, the Riddler was looked at as kind of a minor leaguer with a gimmick. Just to be clear, this isn't my opinion of the Riddler. It's a Dennis O'Neil pin quote from Jim Gordon in a 1989 issue of The Question, where Gordon also tells the soon-to-be released Riddler that Batman has better things to do than chase a small-time has-been. And that's not the only late 80s jab at the Riddler's relevance. Neil Gaiman's story, Win as a Door, follows a TV crew who interviews the Riddler in an old warehouse full of Silver Age props. And by the end of the interview, it becomes increasingly clear that the Riddler, like the oversized props he's sitting on, is clearly a relic of a bygone era.
So you finally figured it out. I was getting bored.
Today, the Riddler is a highly regarded foe of Batman thanks to comic runs like Joseph Loeb and Jim Lee's Hush and Chuck Dixon and Kieran Dwyer's Detective Comics Annual 8. But at first, he wasn't a frequently used foe, appearing in less than 30 comics from 1948 to 1989. His first appearance in Detective Comics 140 establishes Edward as a puzzle-obsessed criminal who leaves riddles, like a literal football stadium-sized jigsaw puzzle, to telegraph his crimes. The Riddler was ultimately foiled but would resurface 2 issues later in Detective Comics 142, and that would be Edward Nigma's last comic appearance for 17 years. Fast forward to 1965 as DC brought back the Prince of Puzzlers for Batman 171. In a serendipitous turn of events, this issue had a profound effect on the 60s Batman TV show, as it was one of the few comics executive producer William Dozer read during development. The remarkable ruse of the Riddler clearly impressed him, since the show's first 2 episodes borrowed heavily from Remarkable Ruse's plot. Enter Frank Gorshin.
He was my first notion for the Riddler and never anybody else.
Thanks to his natural crazy eye and unforgettable hyena laugh, Gorshin took an almost 20-year-old villain with 3 comic appearances and turned him into a campy criminal that would define the character for decades. Aside from a few animated show appearances and a few comic appearances, one of which established Nigma's psychological compulsion to always leave a riddle, the Riddler went back into hiding after the 60s Batman TV series and movie.
The police never found a body. The Prince of Puzzlers may well have escaped underground.
After the show ended, DC wanted to get as far away from the campy Batman image as possible, so DC Comics editor Julius Schwartz blacklisted the TV show's villains until well into the 70s. While the Bat's other rogues eventually bounced back, the Riddler never had anything on the level of Joker's 5-way revenge or the laughing fish to reinvigorate him. And that ultimately brings us back to where we started, with Jim Gordon telling Edward Nygma he was nothing more than a minor leaguer with a gimmick. The suits at Warner Brothers, who were trying to cast a new live-action Riddler, definitely had their work cut out for them. They needed to find a performer who could wipe away the tarnish of the villain the comics tried decently hard to forget, while also living up to Gorshin's Emmy-nominated Nygma. But most of all, Warner's had to find someone who wouldn't offend the sensibilities of critics like USA Today's summer junior movie critic Danny Slasky.
The second time I saw it, when I saw the younger kids, I really wanted to tell them not to see this.
And they found their man in Jim Carrey, because his well-honed buffoonery was more than enough to fit the bill. Just like how every Riddler caper comes with a clue, pretty much every serious comic book movie comes with actor anecdotes about how difficult it was to inhabit the role. Heath Ledger kept a Joker diary and locked himself in a hotel room to prepare. Michael B. Jordan sought out therapy after his Killmonger stint. Now, Paul Dano claims he couldn't sleep because his Riddler scenes were so intense. Just to be clear, I'm not knocking these actors for taking their roles seriously. As a comic fan, I appreciate when these actors treat characters as meaty roles, not just meaty paychecks.
All right, everyone, chill.
Whether or not you agree with Warner's decision to take Batman Forever in a more campy direction, it's clear that Carrey's dedication to the role was just as committed and just as nuanced as any actor's serious rogues.
He's a sycophant, you know, he's like this stalker almost. And he's completely obsessed with Bruce Wayne. He loves the guy, you know, / hates him. It's about seeing somebody who is the guy that you'd love to be and resenting him for it, you know, and that's how it basically, you know, snowballs into this sick fantasy.
With the tilt of the eyebrow and a change in voice tenor,
I'll make you understand.
Carrey turned him from a misunderstood engineer at Wayne Enterprises to an IQ-stealing mastermind in seconds. But it's not just Edward's encounters with Bruce Wayne that define Carrey's portrayal. It's everything about his performance, from the physicality of prancing around the Batcave while destroying it, to whatever the hell this is. Screenwriters can't write that. That expression cannot be properly expressed with words in the parenthetical of a screenplay. Schumacher probably doesn't even know how to ask for it. It happens because a performer of Jim Carrey's caliber, dramatic or comedic, sits in front of a mirror rehearsing their lines while holding the control of every muscle of their body and face.
He rehearses and practices harder than anybody I've ever known. And when he comes to do the scene, it's all spontaneous, but within parameters that he's really worked out. His facial expressions, his body movements, how he uses the cane, how he uses his face. He's extraordinarily professional.
Despite the film's huge price tag, Jim and Joel knew how to work together to get something truly remarkable in the can.
Did you do one take for you and one take for Joel?
Yeah, did a lot of that. You know, when there wasn't real big special effects involved and stuff, you know, Joel would always, we'd go through a bunch of takes and then he'd say, okay, we got it, so have fun.
And it's takes like these where Jim Carrey had a ton of fun, especially with the Riddler's non sequiturs.
Like the jacket, it keeps me safe when I'm jogging at night.
It's no coincidence that a ton of Carrey's good lines are in close-ups. That's because these shots make it easy for the crew to reset take after take and allow him to riff as long as he'd like.
Was that over the top? I can never tell.
Jim's commitment to the role and Joel's leeway in allowing him to experiment helped ensure that Batman Forever became home to one of Jim Carrey's best performances when he was at the peak of his creative powers.
And it's funny because I think sometimes it kind of rubs some people the wrong way, as if he was maybe stealing the show or something, but I mean, the guy's a genius at what he does.
Whether Carrey was trying to or not, he did steal the show, and it seemed that Tommy Lee Jones was not a particular fan of Carrey's performance.
That's what Tommy Lee Jones said to me too. He said he couldn't sanction my buffoonery.
He couldn't?
He couldn't sanction my buffoonery.
What movie is this?
Batman. That's when we did Batman together.
Wait, you're the star, though.
I was the star, yeah. That was the problem.
But here's the thing. Tommy Lee Jones may not have approved of Jim's behavior on set, but Carrey's Riddler is the pinnacle of the cartoonish villainy Warner's wanted out of the Schumacher era of Batman flicks.
Joygasm!
When watching Jones's Two-Face, especially compared to Carrey's Riddler, it just lands like Carrie Elway's claw impression in Liar Liar.
Ooh, watch yourself, it's the claw! Ooh, the claw's coming at you. Ooh, you're scared of the claw.
Which is to say, Jones's performance feels like a phoned-in heel turn to impress a small child. Now that's not to say Tommy Lee Jones isn't a good actor. He is. Fugitive, No Country for Old Men, and JFK are all better movies thanks to his performances, wigs be damned. But I digress. The thing with Jim Carrey's Riddler is that it's the one performance from the Schumacher sequels that lived up to the Burton villains.
Love that joking.
It also delivered on Gorshin's campy legacy and helped revive the Riddler as a core Batman villain to a whole new generation of Batman fans. But more than that, it was also one of Carrey's defining 90s roles.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the almost 30 years since Batman Forever came out, the Riddler still shines. Fans may argue over who's the best Batman, but few put Kilmer on the top of that list.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
Even considering Dano's take on the Riddler, Carrey's over-the-top campy spin is still compelling all these years later. Even if you don't particularly like Batman Forever.
Every day, the future looks a little bit darker. But the past, even the grimy parts of it, keep on getting brighter.
And one last thing. I even bet McDonald's was happy with Batman Forever.
The time has come for the Gotham glassware collection.
Remember these sick-ass mugs?
McDonald's had these cups, and their entire order was gone in 2 days.
And they were like built to last too, because you can get a full set of them on eBay for like 25 to 40 bucks. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you're as excited for the Batman as we are, be sure to check out some of our other features. And as always, be sure to subscribe to IGN.